We are going to talk about some classic Kino today with a look at the 1975 film Rollerball. Now, before we get into this film, I'm going to come out and say it's kind of weird and niche. It's something that I think appeals to my particular taste, which is kind of weird sci-fi dystopian movies with some existential themes thrown in. Like, I liked Equilibrium. I know a lot of people didn't. I liked Annihilation, which a lot of people didn't. Cube is kind of a niche film, but I think it's got, in general, better reviews. And then the Russian version of Solaris was another movie I liked, which is, once again, I think kind of niche. That's in comparison to sci-fi films that I think can be enjoyed by a better audience, like casual sci-fi fans or action movie fans. And in that category, obviously, stuff like Star Wars, but also the Terminator films. If you're a horror movie fan, there's stuff like Alien, or just other films I like that are meant for a broader audience, like the Nolan Batman films or the Lord of the Rings films, which are some of my favorite movies of all time, but I think also do appeal to a wider audience. And I'd say they're like objectively good films. This film has a lot of issues with it, which we'll get into, but it kind of suits my personal taste. So, that being said, let's talk a bit about the 1970s. So, there was a lot of dystopian movies that came out around the 1970s. Some of them came out a couple of years before, and some of them came out a couple of years after. We have a lot of kind of the classic dystopian movies. So, let's just maybe go through a few of them. Fahrenheit 451 came out in 1966. I haven't seen that one, but I did read the book, and I quite enjoyed the book. The Planet of the Apes movies went from 1968 to 1973. That's one of those ones that's more mainstreamy, and I think anyone who likes sci-fi or just action movies in general could appreciate that. There's some other ones here that I haven't heard of. There's one of the many adaptations of I Am Legend, in this case, the Omega Man. There's George Lucas's first film, THX 1138. Let's see here, what else do we have? Soylent Green, which is another Kino movie. That movie's a lot of fun, even if it is been very frequently mocked and parodied. I do like that movie. There's Death Race 2000, which I haven't seen. Logan's Run, starring Basil from Austin Powers. We have Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the second one. Probably the most famous dystopian movie of all time, Mad Max. You have an adaptation of Brave New World in 1980. You have the second Mad Max film in 1981. Scanners in 1981 and Blade Runner in 1982. And then you have another one of the most insane movies ever that I'll have to review at some point. Videodrome in 1983. So it was a really big deal at the time. There was a lot of sci-fi movies, a lot of kind of low-budget sci-fi movies at around this time. This one actually was pretty low budget. This film was made in Canada. I guess it's one of the few good Canadian movies, because most Canadian films are really terrible because they're made by the Canadian government and they're just super ideological, or they're made in Quebec. And I don't really get the sense of humor of people from Quebec. One of the funny things is this film is directed by Norman Jewison, and he's actually not Jewish. It's just a coincidence, which is kind of funny given how many directors are Jewish, and he has Jew in his name, but he's not Jewish. So I think that's kind of funny. So this movie only cost about $5 million to make, and it made $30 million, which is a pretty big profit. The reception is kind of mixed, but it does have, is a bit of a cult classic. I first heard about this movie a long time ago. This was one of my dad's favorite movies when he was in university, and they would often get drunk and watch it. And apparently they came up with their own version of Rollerball, which he didn't really want to tell me about, and I didn't really want to know about. But, yeah, so let's talk about Rollerball. And let's try to get into this. So first off, I think the biggest issue with this film, and this is kind of a problem with a lot of movies during this period, and there's a guy on YouTube called the Pinsky File who does reviews of Star Trek episodes. And he said, like, the first couple seasons sometimes seem really grating or slow or boring. And he said this was because of a filming thing in the 70s, 80s, and the beginning of the 90s where there was no B plot, really. Most of the movie was just focused around one person. And I mean, Rollerball has a bit of some other stuff, but it just kind of follows one person, one plot, and then just kind of cuts scene to scene, and it just makes it kind of feel very slow. And I kind of call it the presence. Uh, that's an aspect of it. There's also just a lot of really long shots that are not edited as short as they could be, and kind of the washed out, not very crisp coloring adds a certain excruciating feel to movies from this time period. So, Rollerball, as I said, takes place in a dystopian future where the world has become run by. I'm not sure, it's not very clear if it's one corporation or it's a series of corporations. I think the world's controlled by one corporation, and then there's a series of departments which function as semi independent states, each one under an executive, who meet collectively to come to decisions. We don't know a ton about the past, and that's kind of part of the movie is that the past was erased at one point in time. So a character refers to there as being three nations when he was growing up, but then the corporate wars happened, and all the corporations merged together. So some cities are under the control of each sub-branch of the corporation. The main character and his team come from Houston, which is under control of the energy section. As with most dystopian stories, there is a form of bread and circuses that's used to keep the public in line. Now, at one point, one of the executives says that we've eliminated humanity's problems. There's no longer war or disease or famine. Everyone has luxury goods. There's no more poverty. I'm going to press a massive X to doubt on that one because we never really see how the average person lives. It's implied that there's very little in the way of personal freedom, and everyone's lives are very highly regimented by the corporate structure. But yeah, getting back to Rollerball, Rollerball's kind of like what the Hunger Games would become. It's an international blood sport that's meant to sate humanity's desire for violence and conflict. Kind of like modern day sports ball. But at the same time, also, I guess, kind of patriotism and group identity, and kind of to a certain extent conceal how boring and gray the world's become under the rule of the corporations. There is an additional aspect to the game of Rollerball. So sorry to make another comparison to Hunger Games, but one of the things that the Hunger Games are meant to demonstrate is how the districts are completely subject to the capital. That is kind of a humiliation ritual. The capital is able to take their children and make them kill each other. And even once they win, they basically spend the rest of their lives as a PR slave to the capital, preaching the advantages of Panem. And it's kind of similar in this perspective where one of the goals of the game is to show that human life is worthless and that individual effort can't succeed. And the game's set up deliberately to try to prevent people from succeeding. I don't even really try to understand the rules. The rules don't make any kind of sense. A lot of people die playing the game. The rules constantly change to try to prevent people from getting too good at it. But things have kind of changed because we have the introduction of a player named Jonathan. Now, Jonathan is the best player of Rollerball in the world and also the best player of all time by far. He's the team captain, and he's become really big. He has a huge fan base. A lot of people follow him. He's come to be viewed as a hero and to be viewed as a idol, and people are starting to look up to him. And that really scares the corporations because they don't want people to start believing that the individual can achieve anything. And this kind of comes into a difficult thing that a lot of societies have kind of come across. Maybe this is kind of a weird reference, but in the Hearts of Iron 4, if you're playing as the Soviet Union, when there's a focus tree, I should say, about propaganda, and one path of it is collective praise or something like that, where the initiative of individual soldiers is played down. If anything, soldiers who are too successful are disappeared, or their accomplishments are suppressed. And then that's kind of the Leninist Trotskyist side. And then the Stalinist side, they encourage the exaltation of individual patriots as symbols of what the socialist system can achieve. And that's kind of one of the challenges when you get into things like this, because you might not like an egoistic society where everybody's just out for their own interest. But at the same time, if you don't have any kind of aspect like that, you're not going to get heroes and exemplars and things like that. So they're really worried about that. So the chairman of the Energy Corporation goes to Jonathan and says, you have to retire now. You can't win another World Series. You've become too good. You've become bigger than the game. That sort of thing. Now, he doesn't tell Jonathan why that's the case. He offers him, like, it doesn't say, but an immense amount of money. Who knows, maybe like hundreds of millions of dollars. And he talks about how great corporate-run society is, but doesn't tell him why he needs to retire. Now, Jonathan doesn't want to leave his career behind where he's a hero, but at the same time, he also kind of harbors a deep hatred for the corporation because they took his wife away, who was really the only woman he ever truly loved, because some corporate executive wanted her. And instead, he now has a series of live-in mistresses that are chosen for him by the corporation, who get rotated every 6 months. I think so he's not able to form attachments to them. Some of aspects of this movie I'm a little unsure about. But yeah, like, so they try to make some deals with the corporate head. He basically says, no, you're not going to get any of the stuff that you want. Jonathan starts to try to research it, but he finds that all the books have been digitized and edited to suit the corporations. And the computers that have all the original copies of this isn't very well maintained. Like, there's a part where he goes to Geneva to see the largest computer in the world, and it just randomly lost the entirety of the 13th century. So all the works of literature, all the history from that time period are gone. And I think that's largely intended as a way of gradually erasing the past. So Jonathan can't find anything there. He winds up going to Geneva, and he finds that the history computer has, not only is it gradually losing things as time goes on, but certain unpleasant things like how the corporations run, what the corporate wars were, has just been completely erased from the past. And he's still kind of struggling to figure out why it is that they want to take him down, why it is they want him to retire. So the thing is, the corporation can't just kill Jonathan or make him die in an accident, because that would make a martyr out of him. I'm not sure how people would necessarily know that the corporation killed him, but he'd go away a legend. You know how a lot of heroes are like that. Like, I think Charlemagne, they say that. Tecumseh, they just kind of ride off into the sunset, or I guess Charlemagne's body was on the throne or whatever, but there's this idea that they'll return one day at the time of greatest need for their nation and save it. So then they play the semifinal, which is against Tokyo, and the game's been changed to remove penalties, which aren't really enforced very well to begin with, and substitutions, and very limited substitutions. They're trying to make the game more violent and more dangerous in the hope that Jonathan will die during a game, and it'll show that he is not above the game. He is subject to the game just like everybody else. During this, his best friend gets permanently crippled by a group of Tokyo members who put him into a coma. What's kind of interesting is after the game, he is basically told by the hospital in Tokyo, you have to euthanize him, you have to euthanize him. And Jonathan's like, no, he's still alive. Even if he's a vegetable, plants still will turn towards the sun. So he tells the man that he's going to bring him back to Houston and pay for his continued medical care. Which is, I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I think it's supposed to show Jonathan is above the system because the guy tries to tell him this is the procedure, you have to do it. And Jonathan just says, I'm above the procedure. They eventually send his wife to him and try to convince him to retire. So then they're playing off against in the last game against New York. And New York's been told explicitly they have to kill Jonathan. They remove a time limit from the game as well as penalties and substitutions. Since this is a game where the team that has the most points at the end of the game wins, if there's no time limit, I don't know how the game would end. I guess once all the players on the other team are dead or incapacitated. So we go through an extremely bloody, gory match. So eventually everybody gets killed off, aside from Jonathan and two other guys. He takes one of them down, and then he's facing the last guy, and he has the metal rollerball in his head. And he's going to smash the guy's skull in, but then decides not. It's kind of like that scene in Star Trek. No, I'm not going to kill him for your amusement. So then he goes up and scores the game's only point and starts skating around the track. Jonathan's beat the game. He's beat the system. He's transcended the corporate world in which individuality is something that doesn't exist. And he's kind of regained the heroic human spirit that the corporation has sought to suppress for all this time. And that's the movie. It has a lot of flaws. I think having three separate rollerball games was a little self-indulgent and kind of dragged the story. I don't know if the first one they had against Madrid was really necessary. I guess they were trying to show like a normal game, a game with heightened stakes, and then a game with insane stakes. But seeing as action is kind of the main drawing point of this movie, I guess they kind of had to put three in. It makes sense, but it kind of pads the running time out. I think a lot of the middle section could probably be edited down. Like, there's this weird scene where the party goers at a Jonathan celebration for how awesome he is take out a gun and start blowing trees up with it, which is kind of a cool scene, but I don't exactly get how it relates. I mean, it's to show how decadent the upper class is, but I don't think it's really necessary or adds anything to the movie. At 2 hours long, this film, at just over 2 hours long, this film probably could have been cut down 15 minutes or so. Some of the scenes where he's interacting with his new mistress, I think, are just kind of not really helpful, and they're kind of boring. So I think you could edit maybe 10 to 15 minutes out of this film. You might want to cut down the rollerball scenes a bit, and it would flow a lot better. But overall, it is a movie I really enjoy. I don't think it's a movie for everybody. I think if you like dystopian, if you like kind of classic sci-fi, if you like kind of weird movies from this time period, I definitely give it a watch. But once again, it's not like something like Lord of the Rings or the Nolan Batman trilogy or even the first Matrix movie that I'd recommend for just about anyone to give it a watch and to give it a try. So that's Rollerball. God bless everyone, and more content to come.